research actually addresses a number of planetary boundaries and their intersection at a local and regional scale. We look at climate change and its impacts on local climate and water resources. We also look at water stress in South Africa, where most of South Africa's rivers are actually over-abstracted and already stressed. And then finally we look at land cover change and biodiversity conservation or biodiversity loss, where many of the natural upland areas of South Africa are also experiencing degradation. So we're looking at the intersection of all of those four planetary boundaries in our research. So our research addresses four intersecting planetary boundaries, and we're really interested in how those manifest at a local or regional level rather than a planetary level. We look at climate change and the way it affects the resilience of society and nature in South Africa and Southern Africa. We also look at water stress in South Africa, where many of the rivers in South Africa are already over-abstracted and overused and highly stressed from both a physical and an ecological perspective. And then finally we look at land cover change and biodiversity integrity, this time focusing on upland or mountain catchments, which are really important for delivery of water and biodiversity services to the country. And we look at how all of these interact with each other to both create stresses for society, but also how we can try and find solutions to overcome those stresses. So in these upland catchments, which are often called water towers, they're the areas where a lot of the water that society uses is produced because mountains get a lot more rainfall than the surrounding low-lying areas. In South Africa, many of these are experiencing enormous land cover change, largely through something called invasive alien species. And these are plant species that are not natural to the area but have come in through European settlements, so for instance pine trees or eucalyptus trees. And these preferentially take over the mountain catchments, sort of replace the existing ecosystems which are very biodiverse, and at the same time use up more water than the natural vegetation, reducing river flows. And so one of the approaches to dealing with this is to restore the catchments to their natural state, so remove the alien vegetation, and that increases the water yields and then also has other benefits through allowing the natural vegetation and biodiversity to recover. And then what we're doing is trying to assess where those kind of interventions can be most effective in terms of both a biodiversity dividend and a water dividend, and how that can offset the impacts of climate change on both biodiversity and water resources. And I must be honest, $1 million Swiss francs goes a lot further in South Africa than it does in Europe probably, so it will buy a lot of resources for us and allow us to really enhance the research that we're doing. Some initial ideas are to deepen the research that we're doing by, first of all, expanding the ecosystem services that we look at through these restoration processes to include other services other than just water. So look much more closely at biodiversity and functional issues in the landscape, but also issues like soil carbon sequestration and soil quality, which all interact together. So we're wanting to take kind of a more holistic view of how these nature-based solutions, as we call them, can really improve multiple different aspects of ecosystems and services for society. And then the second thing we want to do is take the pilot work we've done in these relatively small areas in South Africa and expand that data modeling framework to be able to generate the same kind of information over the whole of the region, over Southern Africa or Africa. And the idea here is that we'll be able to support, that data will then be able to support much better decision-making around where to implement nature-based solutions and what the actual dividends would be, and also support better financial modeling of investment cases in nature-based solutions. And then we have one other idea, which is around creating what we're calling a nature-based solutions academy, which is where we can at our university, create an academy where both young people, policymakers, practitioners can come together to learn more about nature-based solutions and become much better informed both in the policy space in terms of setting up policies that enable better implementation of nature-based solutions, but also for people who are working on the ground or living in these landscapes to enable them to become, to increase their livelihoods, create almost like green livelihoods by becoming landscape stewards and finding ways that they can benefit from their role as stewards in improving the functioning of these landscapes. I think the most important thing is that if you use the kind of methods and data that we produce, you can produce much better decisions and plans around how to restore landscapes to benefit both planet and society. So a lot of the work on nature-based solutions is actually not very well informed by good evidence. And for instance, one of the other studies that we undertook, we reviewed all of the research papers that had looked at nature-based solutions in Southern Africa, and only about 10% of them actually had real hard evidence behind them. A lot of them were sort of arm-waving, sort of suggesting that these would be the benefits. And it's really hard to convince like a treasury in a national department to invest in something if you can't show them what the return on investment is. So that evidence base, I think, is really the way that our research can support action on the ground in the region. Yeah. So one of the proposed ways that to deal with these local scale impacts of landscape change, climate change, and other environmental impacts is through something called nature-based solutions, or in the climate change space, people talk about ecosystem-based adaptation. And that's around really restoring nature, improving the functioning of nature to reduce the impacts of things like climate change or pollution on water quality. So our work was really trying to evaluate the effectiveness of nature-based solutions in mountain catchments for reducing water stress on society. And so we brought together remote sensing to assess where the invasion of aliens in the catchment is largest. We also used high-resolution climate data to assess the impacts of climate change, and we used very high-resolution hydrological models to simulate how the removal of alien vegetation would affect water flows, especially during crisis periods, which are drought periods. And we used the example of the Cape Town drought of 2015 to 2018, where Cape Town nearly ran out of water, to assess the extent to which nature-based solutions, if they had been implemented in the mountain catchments that supply water to Cape Town, could have offset the severity of the drought. And what we showed was that they do indeed reduce the severity of the drought, that at the same time climate change was increasing the severity of these droughts, but that climate change has already progressed to such an extent that nature-based solutions are already roughly at the limits of their capability to offset the impacts of climate change. And so dealing with something like climate change, water resources, landscape change really requires multiple entry points, because no one solution is actually going to be good enough on its own.